Hello, I'm Esther Gidhu-Ewart. It's Wednesday, June 14th. This is Africa 54. As refugees flee Sudan, neighboring countries struggle with caring for their own people displaced by conflict, food insecurity, and instability. A year after armed men attacked St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church in Nigeria, killing 41 worshippers and injuring more, Nigerian officials and the Catholic diocese hold a memorial service and dedicate a park to honor the deceased. And artificial intelligence helps farmers in South Africa to get weather updates, optimize routes, and choose the best time to harvest, store, and transport goods to the market. We'll hear from Oliver Windrum, farmer, co-founder, and chief technology officer of Koronga. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. We begin in Sudan, where fighting rocked several vulnerable cities in the west of the country on Wednesday in an expansion of almost 2-month-old war, triggering displacement of people estimated to have surpassed 2 million. The war between the army and the paramilitary rapid support forces has caused a humanitarian crisis in Khartoum, as well as cities including El Obeid, Nyala, El Fashir, and El Geneina, where more than 1,000 people have been killed. In the capital, Khartoum, residents say there's a shortage of essential provisions and medications. They say entire districts of Sudan's capital no longer have running water, and electricity is only available for a few hours a week, while most hospitals in combat zones are not functioning and aid facilities have been looted. The United Nations expects close to 1 million people to flee Sudan by October, most of them to neighboring countries like the Central African Republic, Chad, Egypt, Ethiopia, and South Sudan. But most of those nations have their own problems with people displaced by conflict who face food insecurity and instability. Henry Wilkins reports from Borota, Chad, on what Sudanese refugees will face in their host communities.
16-year-old Saeed Adam Mohammed says one morning in May he rode his bike down to this patch of ground on the outskirts of Borota, a Chadian town about 5 kilometres from the Sudan border. He saw thousands of Sudanese refugees arriving.
People ran away and came over here, but there is no food or drinking water, no decent food, no clothing.
Some 425,000 refugees have now fled to neighbouring countries because of Sudan's civil war, but many of their host countries face their own conflicts and are struggling to feed their own people amid skyrocketing food prices and inflation. Experts and aid groups say Sudanese refugees face far from certain futures in host countries, including the Central African Republic, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Egypt. The mayor of Borota, Toko Bahat, says the community has done what it can to welcome the refugees.
In Borota, the people are from a mix of places like Kanga and Porto. They know one another. They are like siblings since they come from the same families or tribes. So there is no problem in living together.
Similarly, in South Sudan, many of those fleeing Sudan are South Sudanese returnees. However, 2/3 of South Sudan's population already faces food insecurity and instability in rank, where many refugees have arrived.
The difference with South Sudan compared to perhaps Chad or Egypt is that the majority of people who are coming across the border are returnees. Communities are quite welcoming, and of course we hope that continues. The pressure that this is putting on markets, on the humanitarian response, is definitely going to be difficult for humanitarian agencies and the government.
Most Sudanese refugees, more than 170,000, have fled to Egypt in recent weeks. Egypt's currency has been devalued by 50% against the dollar in the last year, while food prices have risen by 60%. The Central African Republic, where around 14,000 refugees have arrived, has been embroiled in a civil war for more than 10 years, and security is dire. Ethiopia, where thousands of refugees have fled, is recovering from a civil war that ended in November. Eritrea has been accused of forcibly turning away refugees attempting to flee Sudan's fighting. On a visit to Egypt in late May, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees commended Egypt for helping Sudan's refugees, but said we urgently need to mobilise more resources to help them to maintain this generosity. Henry Wilkins for VOA News, Barota, Chad.
Some 110 million people have had to flee their homes because of conflict, persecution, or human rights violations, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. The war in Sudan, which has displaced nearly 2 million people since April, is the latest in a long list of crises that has led to the record-breaking figure. Filippo Grandi, who leads the UN Refugee Agency, told reporters in Geneva, quote, "It's quite an indictment on the state of our world. Last year alone, an additional 19 million people were forcibly displaced, including more than 11 million who fled Russia's invasion of Ukraine." The agency also recorded 35 emergencies last year, which were 3 to 4 times more than in previous years. Grandi told reporters that very few make the headlines and that the war in Sudan fell off most front pages after Western citizens were evacuated. It's been a year since armed men in Nigeria's southwest Ondo state rushed into St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church during a mass and attacked worshippers, killing 41 people and injuring scores of others. Nigerian officials and the Catholic diocese held a memorial service and dedicated a park to honor the memory of those killed. Timothy Obiezu has the latest from Owo 1 year on.
A facelift for an auditorium once stained with blood. 41 worshippers ruthlessly killed on June 5th of 2022 when gunmen opened fire and detonated explosives inside St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church in Owo, Nigeria. 87 people were severely injured, including Margaret Atta, who lost both legs when a bomb exploded next to her.
It's noisy because since then, if I hear any sound, any strange sound, my mind will just jump. Whenever I just flash back to that very day, my mind will just say, I cannot go.
Nigerian authorities say it was the first attack in southwest Nigeria linked to a terror group. Officials say it was carried out by the Islamic State West Africa province, or ISWAP. Over the weekend, the Catholic Church Diocese and Ondo State authorities held a memorial service to honor the dead and show support for the survivors. They also dedicated a park in memory of the victims. Ondo Deputy State Governor Lucky Ayeda Tiwa spoke about the government's investigation.
I want to announce to you that some of the culprits have been arrested and the investigation has gone very far. Such attack will never happen again. Yeah.
The victims' families and survivors like Esther Okundalaye say the memories of that day are still fresh and changed them forever.
One thing this has taught us is to be self-conscious and to be self-aware of ourselves, because if you see a strange face in the church or a strange person beside you or walking around, you tend to call the attention of the security personnel.
I remember my parents by the love my mother used to show to me, and my dad too, with the encouragement they normally used to give me.
Critics have accused the Nigerian government of not doing enough to secure the country. In late May, Bola Tinubu was sworn in as president, taking the reins from former President Muhammadu Buhari and vowing to make security a top priority. Timothy Obiezu for VOA News, Owo, Ondo State, Nigeria.
Former President Donald Trump remained defiant following his not guilty plea in a Florida courtroom Tuesday. The Republican presidential frontrunner is facing 37 federal felony counts, including illegally retaining classified information and obstructing justice. White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara has this report.
A defiant Donald Trump made a stop at a popular Cuban restaurant in Miami to greet supporters.
Food for everyone. Food for everyone.
Following his arraignment where he pleaded not guilty Tuesday. The first former U.S. president to face federal charges spoke later from his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey.
Today we witnessed the most evil and heinous abuse of power in the history of our country. Very sad thing to watch. A corrupt sitting president had his top political opponent arrested on fake and fabricated charges.
Hundreds of supporters and protesters were outside the Miami court, where Trump was arraigned on 37 felony counts, including willfully retaining more than 100 classified documents, some related to U.S. nuclear and defense plans, and conspiring to obstruct justice. The FBI recovered the documents from his Florida home Mar-a-Lago last August. Justice Department Special Counsel Jack Smith was appointed to lead the federal investigation.
Our nation's commitment to the rule of law sets an example for the world. We have one set of laws in this country, and they apply to everyone.
Smith said he's seeking a speedy trial, but it may be months before it begins. Trump is running again for president in 2024 and is the Republican frontrunner. An Ipsos ABC News poll shows that while Americans view the new charges as more serious than those brought in late March by a Manhattan grand jury over hush money allegedly paid to adult movie star Stormy Daniels before the 2016 election, the public remains split on whether Trump should be charged with a crime.
I don't think that Trump's position in the lead of the Republican primary is likely to be shook by any of this, but I do think these potentially have an impact, if he does end up being the nominee, on his ability to win the general election by damaging his standing with independents.
47% of Americans believe the charges are politically motivated, according to the same Ipsos poll.
To me, I think this is a travesty. It's surreal.
If proven guilty, Trump could face prison time. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Washington.
For analysis on Trump's indictment, I'm joined live via Skype from New York by David Monda, a professor at City University of New York. Professor Monda, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you for having me.
So how does this indictment damage Trump's bid for the 2024 presidential election?
I think it both damages, but it also helps his campaign. And I'll explain that in these two ways. It damages his campaign because obviously it's not good for anybody who wants to become president to have these federal charges against them, especially if you want to lead a country like the United States, which prides itself in the rule of law. However, it helps his campaign in another way because in the primaries with Republican voters, it reinforces this idea that the law is being applied selectively. So Trump, within this effort to try and get the nomination from the Republican Party to face Joe Biden, is really reinforcing that idea of the injustice of the legal system, and he's using it to his advantage politically to raise money and also to gather his supporters together and the party, the Republican Party around him. So there's both legal and political angles to it, some that are positive and others that are challenging.
So a former president maintains he is innocent, but what lies ahead for his legal team to prove his innocence?
A lot lies ahead. There's a 37 counts. Remember, this is a speaking indictment, so basically it lists down all the charges. And a lot of Trump's own words have been used against him in this indictment. So it's really going to be very difficult for his legal team in order to try and defend their client. And I think one of the main efforts that Trump's legal team will be trying to use is to show prosecutorial injustice. In other words, the prosecutor using their powers in an arbitrary way, in a way that's not appropriate, but also to have some of the charges dismissed after the discovery process, once that charges are actually read out. Because should this go to trial, a lot of these charges on Trump are extremely, extremely difficult and dangerous, particularly because they come under the Espionage Act. And that's a very broad interpretation because the Espionage Act deals with issues of security of the state. So for his legal team is really to try and get some of the charges dismissed before it goes into trial. But once in trial, it will be very difficult to prove Trump innocent, although that is still possible.
Professor, very quickly, what does Trump's indictment say about the U.S., legal independence?
It really shows that the U.S. Judicial institutions are independent because we had a special prosecutor appointed, a federal prosecutor, special counsel appointed to lead the process so it wouldn't look like the government was interfering. But secondly, it really reinforces this idea that nobody is above the law in spite of your previous standing in society, and nobody is below the law. In other words, the law needs to be applied equally, whether you are a former president or whether you're a regular citizen. So I think this is a very interesting thing to think about, the equality before the law in the U.S. system.
David, thanks. Professor David Monda at City University of New York, speaking to us live from New York City. Now, we'd like to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come in our tech report, using AI to help farmers get real-time updates on weather conditions, route optimization, and the best time to harvest their crops. Stay with us.
Straight Talk Africa. A delegation from 6 African countries headed by the President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, is getting ready to negotiate a road to peace between Ukraine and Russia. Join me, Heidi Adams, and my guests as we discuss the chances for success from this African Leaders Initiative on the next Straight Talk Africa.
In other news, more than 100 people are dead in northern Nigeria after a boat capsized on the Niger River Monday night. The boat carrying around 250 passengers traveling from a wedding capsized in the early hours of Monday in north-central Kwara State. More than half of the victims were from one village. President Bola Tinubu offered his condolences to the families of the victims on Wednesday, saying his government would look to improve inland water transport safety. Human Rights Watch says the Rwandan-backed M23 militia has committed murder, rape, and other war crimes in the Democratic Republic of Congo's volatile east in recent months. Human Rights Watch is calling for the UN Security Council to add M23 leaders as well as Rwandan officials who are assisting the armed group to the Council's existing sanctions list. Clementine Dimonjoy, an African researcher at the New York-based Rights Monitor, says the M23's unrelenting killings and rapes are bolstered by the military support of Rwandan commanders. The death toll from a Kenyan starvation cult crossed 300 on Tuesday after authorities exhumed more bodies in the Shakahola forest in one of the largest cult-related tragedies in recent history. Authorities say the dead were members of the Good News International Church, led by Paul Mackenzie, who is accused of ordering his followers to starve themselves and their children to death so they could go to heaven before the end of the world. More than 600 people are still reported missing. Zimbabwe's central bank's efforts to arrest the sharp depreciation of the country's dollar seem to be failing as the currency took a nosedive and was trading Monday at more than 6,000 against the US dollar from about 2,600 on the black market, forcing prices up. Columbus Mavunga reports from Harare, where economists disagree on what the government should do.
Samantha Sibanda says the new measures by the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe have not helped the economy. Instead, she's seeing prices go up and thus making it difficult for her to look after her 4 dependents.
There's no savings at all. And, daily there's a shock that I get as well, just to see that everything is just going up.
But Trust Chikora, an economic commentator, says it will not be long before people like Sibanda start benefiting from the central bank's measures. He says that the liberalization of the exchange rate means the real value of the local dollar will soon be found.
They are increasing statutory reserves for banks to reduce money supply growth. Money supply growth is the one that drives the exchange rate. If you reduce money supply growth, you reduce the need to have the barrel rate continuing to go up. If we can stabilize the exchange rate, we will then be able to stabilize prices.
Not everyone agrees. Prosper Chitambara is a senior economist with the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe. He says Zimbabwe needs to work on increasing production and cutting government expenditure and then think of stabilizing the currency.
Another alternative could be maybe to adopt full dollarization, but with a clear roadmap of the benchmarks that must be achieved in order to then de-dollarize. But ultimately, de-dollarization, again, is a function of confidence. And confidence is a function of implementing the right monetary, fiscal, and institutional reforms.
Zimbabwe's government has ruled out dollarization, saying the country does not have enough US dollars to sustain the economy. That may mean a longer time for Zimbabweans like Sibanda before they see stable prices. Columbus Mafungam for VOA News, Harare, Zimbabwe.
It's time for our tech segment, and joining us now is our technology reporter, Paul Ndiho. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Esther. Using AI is helping farmers get real-time updates on weather conditions, route optimization, and decide on the best time to harvest their crops, store them, or transport them to the market. In South Africa, analysts say that by embracing AI, farmers can increase their productivity, reduce costs, and improve the quality of their products, ultimately benefiting both farmers and consumers. For more, I'm joined by Oliver Windram, farmer and co-founder and Chief Technology Officer of Koronga in South Africa. Welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Let's start by you telling us a little bit about what you do.
We're a tech company that are basically building tools to help farmers understand and value what they grow. We're building tech that essentially allows a farmer to take their smartphone and point it at their crop that they've just harvested, and that gives them a grade. And then once they've got a quantitative valuation of the grade of what they've grown, we help them to discover an appropriate market to sell that grade of produce. Obviously agricultural strategy, but also just the environment that the farmer's working within. And there are things that he can control, but things that he or she can't control as well. So you're going to get this natural variance in production, but we're tackling food waste, but we're also tackling food security in a meaningful way, because we're helping farmers essentially, in some cases double the amount of what they sell, simply because they're now getting these new opportunities of finding ways to sell perfectly edible and healthy produce that they perhaps couldn't have in the past.
You are bringing technology into the hands of farmers who would otherwise maybe have issues trying to sell their produce to the marketplace.
Yes, and I'd say the technology is a big part of it, but it's also, I think we work a lot with small-scale farmers, and one of the things that we've realized that the way they interface with their markets is not perhaps as useful as it can be. And this is not I don't think this is a failing of farmers specifically. This is more of a failing of the infrastructure that has arisen globally, I'd say, in response to the agricultural production system. Most buyers and aggregators and wholesalers prefer to work with large-scale growers because of sort of two fundamental aspects of food production, especially when it comes to high-value horticulture. If you're a buyer, you want to get something at the best price, obviously. But the two things that are really important to you is you want something called consistency of supply. So you want your tomatoes, your cabbages, your cauliflowers coming in at a fixed rate throughout the week, right? So you're on X number of tons every day. Ideally, you want it first thing in the morning so that you can sort of optimize your schedule for delivering and getting goods to your customers, who may be supermarkets or restaurants, street vendors, whoever they may be. And the second thing you also want is, and I'd say all industries want this, they want some form of standardization of production and standardization of product. So those standards may be different across different markets, like I've just mentioned, but they want that standard.
You grew up on a tomato farm in Zimbabwe. Back in the day, people didn't use technology, but a lot of people were able to produce like tomatoes and other produce and take it to the marketplace. What is so different today, now that you are into this space where you're trying to bring certain tools to farmers to help them maybe access even better markets?
I grew up in this large tomato farm. My dad was the farmer. When all of the land transition started to happen, he started working with a lot of small-scale farmers that had been farming already for, maybe 10 years alongside him. And he saw that they still had these sorts of problems, even back then. But he sort of managed to provide a level of training and standards to these small-scale growers so they could take advantage of all the key skills he had amassed as a successful large-scale grower. And when ultimately, when this land transition happened, very little in terms of productivity for the supply demands my father had in Harare were affected, because suddenly all of these farmers he had been working with were trained up to the right spec. So he could go out to the rural areas, he could just take his 8-ton truck, he'd buy off them, and then he'd sell it at the retail store that my family set up in Harare. So we wanted to see, couldn't we just use tech to try and enhance this communication and improve these relationships with that, right? Rather than setting up a centralized training facility, which doesn't really scale. Whereas with tech, it can scale very rapidly.
How do people, let's say, perceive tech or bringing tech into their farms?
Farmers aren't necessarily scared of adapting to new technology. Every time I speak to a farmer, most farmers are inherently almost scientists in nature, right? They experiment daily, trying new things on their farm. I find that all farmers we talk to are very excited about what we're doing.
Oliver, thank you so much for your time.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks very much.
That was Oliver Windram, co-founder and chief executive officer of Koronga in Boston, Massachusetts. That's today's Tech Report. Back to you, Esther.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that report. Be sure to join Paul Ndiho every Wednesday for another tech segment on Africa 54. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington,